Hello, this is Cole DeSantis with the Exploring the Faith YouTube channel. I'm joined here today with Andrew Likoudis. He is the editor of the book Faith in Crisis, and he is the founder of the James Likoudis Legacy Foundation, which is an apologetical organization named after his grandfather, James Likoudis, the Catholic apologist. Andrew has recently written a book, Faith in Crisis, in which he discusses various theological and pastoral questions arising from the debates between traditionalism and liberalism in the church and the radical traditionalists reactionary in the church. Not too long ago, Andrew and I met over video to discuss some of the themes in his book. And we sort of talked about the broad pastoral and theological questions arising from his book. In this interview, we hope to discuss some of the more practical elements surrounding the debates arising from traditionalism. And in particular, we hope to discuss the nature of theological discourse, the nature of authority, and just some of the more practical elements of how to navigate the crisis in the church. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and I'd like to just say thank you again to Andrew for joining us today.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And so in our last interview, we kind of talked about the broad sort of theological and pastoral questions rising from the debates resulting from the council. And in today's interview, I kind of hope to discuss something that for some people may kind of be an unexpected theme in your book. In your book, you talk about the nature of the media and the role of media and sensationalism in theological discourse.
Yeah.
And a lot of people may think, well, what does that have to do with the council? Shouldn't we be talking about the council documents or the liturgy or, James Martin or Archbishop Lefebvre, all that stuff?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess before we get into that, I'd like to just sort of begin by beginning with the broadest possible framework, and that is, what is the traditional set of moral principles that the Catholic Church has concerning the media, how to properly interact in the media, truth within the context of mass communication?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. Let me just start by saying that the way Catholics interact with the media is not neutral. There are moral principles to guide it. The popes have spoken out about the way journalists and reporters, especially, but any Catholic interacts with the media, especially the news media. A few things to keep in mind, particularly, is that the media is both something that habituates patterns of thoughts among the faithful. So the way you report on something has a real practical implication in the faith lives of Catholics. Second thing is that deliberately misrepresenting the truth is the same, morally speaking, as lying. So if you're creating spin and sensationalism, deliberately misrepresenting the facts, trying to fit an event or an occurrence into a specific narrative that you've already developed, that's all morally questionable, if not outright wrong. And Catholics should try to interpret what they see in the best possible light. So the Catechism is very clear on that point, which is if there are differing interpretations of an action, you're first called to give the more favorable and charitable interpretation first. Not to do so is a failure in charity, which can be a sin. So Catholics, especially if you're responsible, and especially if it's your job to be a reporter or something, you have to be very principled in the way you approach how you present the news and facts and different things happening in the church. We don't see a lot of great principled reporting nowadays, unfortunately. It's a lot of sensationalism, a lot of clickbait, um, trying to use algorithms to um, just bolster your audience and your presence, without a lot of attention to um, the effects that you're creating, whether you're polarizing people or um, lending your narrative to like fear-based tactics and um, distorting the facts and creating a real crisis of faith in the lives of um, your listeners and your viewers.
Yeah.
So
And so I
I'd
guess,
say, go ahead.
oh, no, you can go ahead.
I was just going to say that's where I'd start when we're talking about media. We really need to insist, especially Catholics, we need to insist on being faithful, not just uh, to our not just to God, but by extension, to the way we present truth in our lives.
Yeah. And so I
Not
guess sort of,
just giving lip service to like I have faith in God, but you don't act like it in the way
yeah.
you present things.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that seems to be a recurring issue. I mean, I think, first of all, we don't even have a commitment to truth in its most general sense in the modern media. I mean, the one famous newspaper has as its motto, "Democracy dies in darkness," but unfortunately, like you said, this is a real issue that the media are struggling with. But again, with most of the Catholics in the media, they are virtually indistinguishable from their non-Catholic counterparts. So, but I guess this sort of raises an important point that dovetails off of this. As you had said, and I think this is an important point. It's literally, quite literally, impossible to be 100% unbiased when presenting information or news. But how does one maintain that balance between being wishy-washy, that sort of fake commitment to objectivity, and then on the other hand, being um, overly polemical or sensationalist?
Yeah, I think we need to start by identifying our own biases. Um, and part of the way you do that is by interacting on the regular with people that you disagree with and interpreting them charitably. When you understand your interlocutor or your opponent, um, and you know their position well, you don't need to misrepresent it, because if you if you are confident in your own position, you should be able to address their counter arguments with your own fairly and also persuasively. Otherwise, why are you holding the views that you're holding?
Yeah.
Um, it's also easy to um, start from a place of tribalism, and this is something to be avoided. Also, it's um, you're not defending the truth per se. You might you might be just trying to defend your tribe or your ideology, and that has a if you take your tribalism or your ideology as your starting point, then principles go out the window, and um, you're not arguing from a place of what is the truth and trying to find the truth. You're starting from a place of I already possess all the answers and my opponent is already wrong about everything, and so you're just arguing at them instead of trying to dialogue or debate on the truth of a matter or the principles of a matter.
Yeah. And so, we could basically have an entire discussion. We could go on all day or basically for days just talking about, objectivity and, integrity in the media more generally. But since we're talking about this in a religious context, there is a pastoral element to it. And so obviously there is Catholic media, and I use the term media in a sort of all-embracing sense to refer to like actual newspapers, magazines, to some guy with a blog or YouTube channel, to books, to any kind of popular, publication.
Mhm.
And, anytime you see an organization as large as the Catholic Church, you're going to see, media within that organization crop up that sort of represents any and all of the diversity that exists within that institution. So, what do you believe are the sort of historical or ideological circumstances that led to the rise? Because in my estimation, from my experience, there is a lot of sensationalism and there's a lot of polemicism in a lot of the radical left and the radical right within the church.
Yeah.
What do you see as the ideological and historical circumstances that led to that?
Well, it's a like you said, it's a very broad topic. Um, there have always been sort of ideological factions within the church. This is clear as early as, as early as the church fathers. You can see different sides opposing each other, and some of them might have orthodox views on certain issues and unorthodox views on other issues. But the truth is usually never found at the extremes. There were many, for example, early church fathers who were what you would consider on the far right. They'd consider themselves hyper traditional or hyper orthodox, but they were eventually condemned by the popes for being what was termed rigorist. So, for example, Hippolytus and Saint Cyprian were condemned on the issue of confession and on baptism because they didn't want to accept that the church could allow for the faithful to have confession multiple times in their lifetime. Or with baptism, the church wanted to just say you only had to be baptized once, but these rigorists who are actually heretics because of how far they took the rigorism, they would say if you fell into schism and you wanted to come back, you would have to be rebaptized. And the church said, no, that's not how it works. And the church saw this strictness as not being merciful, but the rigorists took it as the church being lax. And so there was this ideological conflict, but ultimately, whose authority is it to judge these matters but the church's? So ultimately, if you don't defer to the church, then you will be stuck in schism, clinging to your idea of what's right and what's wrong.
Yeah.
But it's not a position of epistemological humility, because the arbiter of divine truth claims is the church. That authority has been handed to the church and to no one else.
Yeah. And I think this leads back to sort of a broader issue concerning the nature of authority. And so I think with radical traditionalism, some of the issues that arise from the more radical forms of traditionalism tend to be the same as a lot of the issues that arise from liberalism, or at least radical liberalism, but it tends to be much more subtle, because a lot of it is, again, like you said, this lack of epistemic humility, this and this notion that we know better than the church.
Yeah.
And so with liberalism, or at least with radical liberalism, it challenges the church by virtue of just simply saying the church condemned female ordination, the church is against gay marriage, the church uphold certain traditional doctrines. Oh, well, the church is just wrong.
Mhm.
The problem with radical traditionalism is they don't explicitly say that. But they still fall into schism. And so there's obviously some issue of authority. And so what they do is, as should be clear for anyone who's been following the issue, is they pit more traditional interpretations or expressions of the faith against, later expressions, even if
Mhm.
both technically fall within the realm of orthodoxy. Or they'll, pit the council against what came before the council.
Yeah.
So how does one sort of notice or pick up on these trends without getting sucked into them? Because I think it's very tempting for a lot of Catholics to fall into that mindset, because a lot of faithful Catholics and a lot of traditional Catholics want to strictly adhere to tradition, and they want to be faithful to the authority of the church.
Mhm.
And so it's a lot easier for most practicing Catholics to fall into the rebellion of the far right than the far left, you know, precisely
Yeah.
because it's more subtle. So how
Yeah.
does one uncover it in the midst of its subtlety?
Yeah. There's with with the liberal dissenters, it was usually um, under the banner of modern science or um, being with the times or um, just having a greater historical perspective. Um, that was that coupled with modern notions that sort of dispensed with divine law, usually due to exclusive use of the historical critical method. This was all taken together. This produced a lot of opportunities for dissent called theological liberalism, um, which doesn't place much emphasis on divine truth claims. Now, on the opposite side, you have so on the left you have people like Hans Kung and Charles Curran and um, who's another one? Um, Maybe you could say like Edward Skillebeck or something. On the far right, you have the same method, or you have a similar method being applied, where it's like the equal and opposite reaction.
Yeah.
It's we have an older perspective, therefore our claims are more correct, because let's say, they've stood the test of time, or but both of those don't account for the errors that um, can accompany being a product of your time, or not being a product of your time. Chronology has little to do with it. Um, you can have an older practice that is, you know, it's long standing, but it could be wrong for a lot of reasons, like slavery. Um, you can also have a newer practice that is wrong for all sorts of reasons, like IVF or contraception. Um, but with the right, it's become a more pernicious uh, issue of late, because conservatives or people on the far right, I don't want to say conservatives because it's not being very conservative to dissent. Um,
Ironically,
yeah, I mean, the same with traditionalism. You're not being very traditional when you dissent from the church's um, standard of orthodoxy, even if you call yourself traditional. Um, it's the whole problem with like antiquarianism. Something isn't right because it's older. It might be right and older, and that's fine. Um, but the problem the problem on the right is that it's masquerading under the banner of orthodoxy, um, when it's not in fact orthodox. because the standard of orthodoxy is the church's teaching. That's the proximate rule of faith. So Catholics are called to follow whatever is the proximate rule of faith, which is whatever the church is currently teaching, because the church can have revised its earlier teaching or come to greater clarity about an issue. So it's not necessarily just like, I'm going to stick with what the church taught previously. It's no, you have to stick with what the church is currently teaching, because the church grows in understanding over time. As De Verbum 8 says, the church is the custodian of the deposit of faith, but is always growing in its understanding of the deposit of faith, and will do so until the end of time. So we can't just say, I'm going to follow this earlier practice because it's existed for longer. That's not a standard of orthodoxy. That's a standard of just like, it's not really a standard. It's just like the chronology is behind this practice, so I'm going to follow it.
Yeah. And I feel like this also gets into something that you see a lot in canon law, which I think is sort of beyond the scope of what we were hoping to discuss here, but it's this notion of knowing the difference between an infallible versus a fallible teaching, between an immutable teaching of the church versus a teaching that could potentially be subject to change, to knowing the difference between a change in an expression of our teaching versus a change in the substance versus a change in the expression.
Mm-hmm.
So I think part of it is just because a non-infallible part of church teaching has changed, or just because how we express or implement church teaching has changed, doesn't mean that the faith itself is changing.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so again, there's a difference between saying, the current state of the magisterium is the proximate rule of faith, versus saying that the church has to always maintain continuity between the past and the present. Those two things can coexist. And I think liberals and conservatives misunderstand that for different reasons. Liberals, they don't really misunderstand it, they just reject that tradition is important at all. Conservatives misunderstand it in the sense that there's a lot of nuances that I think they aren't understanding. And
Yeah.
I know, again, this is canon law, theology, divine revelation, which is a little bit beyond the scope. Is there anything you'd like to say, just sort of touching on that or speaking to that? Or
Well, the conservatives would say, and I consider myself conservative. I'm pretty conservative, but I'm not a traditionalist. And I don't think you need to addend the term Catholicism or Catholic with a prefix, like, or a, like you shouldn't have to say I'm a traditional Catholic or I'm a conservative Catholic. It should just be I'm Catholic.
yeah,
If you have political views besides that, you should say I'm a Catholic who is a conservative or something like that. But as soon as you modify the term Catholic, it's no longer universal, which is what the term Catholic means, because you've tried to pigeonhole it into a specific category, a specific ideological bias. So, but I will say, traditionalists tend to fall back on tradition as like. So you were saying like liberals might say they discount tradition because it doesn't fit their idea of what the modern world has said is acceptable and not acceptable. Traditionalists will do the opposite, and they'll say, I'm going to do what's traditional, regardless of what even the church has said is more acceptable today. So that's an error by the same, it's the same misuse of the factor of time as it relates to our faith.
yeah. And so really, I think a lot of it comes down to confusing a specific interpretation of Catholicism with with Catholicism as such. And again, not to say there isn't a correct interpretation of Catholicism, but again, I think to assume that a specific approach to theology always has the right answers, or
Mhm.
to insist on dogmaticism on parts of church teaching that are open to debate or, revision, or that haven't been defined at all, I think that leads to a lot of problems.
Ultimately, you have to come to terms with the fact that you can argue these things forever if you want. But once the church has sort of closed the question or made a decision, if you want to be a faithful Catholic, then your parameters sort of your how do I say this? The boundaries of like what is considered um, compatible with the faith it has to fit within those boundaries. Now there's room for speculation of like whether certain boundaries are fixed or not. Um, like with the question of blessing gay unions, a couple of years ago, the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith came out and said, no, it's not possible to bless these unions. And then later they came out and said, but it's okay to bless couples in those unions. So the boundaries hadn't changed, but the way that speculative theology works is that it looked for a different avenue within those boundaries that doesn't compromise the boundaries but still resolves the pastoral question that they sought to address. So they didn't change the moral framework, but they within those boundaries there was room for development, um, which could fix the pastoral question while maintaining the moral framework.
Yeah. And so this actually, I think, to kind of get back to sort of our original trajectory of talking about the nature of theological discourse, there, of course, is the question. One way in which a lot of people get sucked into radical traditionalism is through, again, not looking at the subtle ways in which radical traditionalism falls into the same pitfalls or the equal and opposite pitfalls as liberalism. But another way is through radical traditionalists sort of identifying themselves as sort of the victims of an unfair persecution in the
Mhm.
church. And that's usually another technique used to draw people into more radical forms of traditionalism. And so, how does one sort of respond to that approach of sort of bringing people into the movement?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to observe. One thing I'll say is when you make yourself the custodian of the faith, when you role play as the defender of the faith, um, then when you are attacked, or when you are corrected, or when the church steps in and tries to say that you're creating problems, um, it's perceived as persecution and it's perceived as an attack on the faith because you've made yourself out to be the defender of the faith or the custodian of the faith. So that's where the sort of persecution complex arises from, um, and then it compounds over time because as they're attacked and as people see what's perceived as an injustice, they claim it's an injustice. Um, People want to have solidarity with the victims, or they want to have like solidarity with people who are being abused, or something like that. Um, so it leads to growth in their numbers, but it it it's not a testament to the veracity of their truth claims.
Yeah. And a lot of it does come back to, again, what you mentioned earlier as a lack of epistemic humility, right? I mean, the notion that every single element of my interpretation of Catholicism is identifiable with the actual correct way Catholicism is meant to be interpreted, or the belief that Catholicism is, or the belief that absolute, so the absolutizing of potentially changeable elements of church teaching and practice, so that any change is basically apostasy. But
Yeah.
I guess, just to sort of play devil's advocate a little bit here, a lot of traditionalists may argue that and this is maybe not so much coming from radical traditionalists, who like think about people in the Society of St. Pius X or Sedevacantists, where the minute the church brings down the gauntlet, they're so convinced that they're correct that they wouldn't mind doing something that could potentially be deemed as schism, because it's just a way of sort of preserving the truth. Like
Yeah.
their approach to Catholicism is correct, so they're willing to become a fringe or underground movement to sort of keep the momentum of their movement going.
Yeah.
But the problem is, you see this more, what I'm about to say is something that could potentially be said by a more moderate traditionalist, or by sympathetic people outside of the movement, where they may say something like, the issue is not the Latin Mass. The Latin Mass was used for, 1500 years. It produced all these great saints, theologians, mystics, doctors of the church. There's obviously something good and holy about the Latin Mass. And there's also something good or holy about the post Vatican II Mass. But like, when someone like St. Thomas Aquinas or Padre Pio, as well as, some radical traditionalists in some makeshift chapel who's with questionable holy orders, who's, declared himself to be the Pope, when both of those people are celebrating the Latin Mass, the issue is probably not the Latin Mass itself. The problem is certain individuals with or ideologies within the traditionalist movement. So why not go after the certain individuals or groups like within the traditionalist movement? Why not try to prevent the radicalization, and why go after the Latin Mass itself? It's like no one would suggest that because of the fact that statistically the majority of people to celebrate the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom are Eastern Orthodox, that means that Eastern Byzantine Rite Catholics shouldn't exist, you
Mhm.
know, because the Byzantine liturgy is predates the schism. It predates whatever led the Orthodox into their errors, and so it's something that should be preserved. It is the rightful possession of the church.
Mhm.
So again, this is just like playing devil's advocate. So
Sure.
why not make a distinction between the Latin Mass as such and some of the radicalization that takes place within that movement, and why not go after the latter while trying to preserve the former?
Sure. The issue with the Latin Mass isn't that it's bad or that it's not a worthy celebration of worship of God. It's not unworthy of God, or it's evil or anything like that. That's not the problem. The problem is that it's it's become ideologized to the point where groups have been willing to go into schism over it, and it is the rallying point for schism. So the SSPX went into schism over the Latin Mass. Sedevacantists have gone into schism over the Latin Mass. Um, Keep in mind, the Latin Mass it's not the Roman Rite itself. The Latin Mass is a variation of the Roman Rite. So we still have the Roman Rite present in the new Missal. Um, since Vatican I and earlier, even in Trent, um, it was doctrinally established that the Pope has uh, complete authority over the liturgy. It, he can't change the substance of the sacraments, but as far as the form of the liturgy goes, the way the missal is written, the way the liturgy is structured, He has authority over all of that. So whatever change occurs, if it occurs authoritatively, it is binding on the faithful. If the faithful are willing to go into schism over a change that's been made, that means that they're putting um, their obligations aren't correctly ordered. So they're putting their obligation to a specific missal or a specific liturgical form in front of their obligations to the church's divinely established authority in St. Peter. Um, Following the church means following St. Peter. If you are following a form of the missal or a rubric in front of your authority, like the the key, the holder of the keys, if you're preferring a missal to St. Peter, you're not being faithful to the church, and therefore you're outside of communion. You're no longer acting as a faithful Catholic by definition.
Yeah. And, I think there's a lot of, important points of nuance here that I think, like for me personally, I believe it was a mistake to, uh, completely like to tighten the traditional Latin Mass, to get rid of the Latin Mass. But at the same time, the reason why I could never go down the path of the Society of St. Pius or Sedevacantists is because why would the church, you know, ever make as its normative form of liturgy anything that's bad or destructive to souls? Yeah, it can't. That's a
No,
theological impossibility.
right. Well, because the church is indefectible, um, it can't establish disciplines that are harmful for the faithful. The Holy Spirit's protection given at Pentecost, promised to Peter um, in Matthew 17, it's you are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church. The gates of hell won't prevail against it. Therefore, what the church teaches, by definition, is what Christ teaches. And Christ said to the apostles, "He who hears you hears me." What that means is, if you follow the church, you're safe. If you follow the church, you're doing God's will. If you don't follow the church, by definition, you're going against God's will.
Yeah.
Um, if you The trouble I have with the argument about um, whether it's just harmful discipline or not, um, it doesn't need to be harmful for the church to recognize that it's no longer a fitting practice for whatever reasons it determines are valid reasons. Um, if the church wants to reform the liturgy and wants the faithful to practice celebrating a new missal in the vernacular in a more modern approach to liturgy, it has that authority and can do so. Just because something's modern doesn't mean it's wrong any more than because something's old means it's wrong.
Yeah.
It's the church who is the arbiter of the moral principles and the sacraments. The church is the dispenser of the sacraments, and it is itself a sacrament in a certain sense. It's the church is often referred to as the sacrament of salvation. Um, Belonging to the church is necessary for salvation. Um, Breaking communion with the church has always been seen as a very grave evil, um, graver even than heresy, as far as Augustine was concerned. So it's not just about whether this mass is more beautiful and more worthy of God, or more, more aesthetic. Um, Maybe you think it deepens your prayer life more because you can be more wrapped up in it, but maybe the church isn't calling you to have that really experiential, like spiritual experience. Maybe it's calling you to be obedient, and maybe that's not comfortable. It doesn't have to be comfortable for you to follow the church. I'm sure when Christ was carrying his cross up Calvary, it was not comfortable, but he still did it.
Yeah. And I think, obviously virtue is obedience is a virtue. And I feel like you're absolutely correct in the sense that sometimes God places us in uncomfortable or difficult situations to test our, devotion or dedication to a specific virtue. But I feel like, what you said actually raises an interesting point. I believe that a lot of, at least in terms of the spiritual and emotional impact of the Latin Mass, I believe that it is possible to have that in the new Mass, in the post Vatican II liturgy, because I believe that it's possible to celebrate the new Mass reverently and, in a traditional way. And the fact that the same church that produced the Latin Mass is also the same church that produced the Novus Ordo. And so I feel like a lot of this, the seeds of the same fruit are present in both liturgies. And I think the reason why a lot of people have a difficult time come to sort of to deal with the flip side of the issue. So to one set of issues could say, oh, it's not the Latin Mass, it's the people. Don't take away the Latin Mass. Try to be more tough on sedevacantism or other radical ideologies. But to play devil's advocate on the other side, I think it would be easy to argue that um, a big reason why a lot of people, and again, I'm not claiming to read hearts, but I think why a lot of people don't want to just ride out the storm and you know stay with the bulk of Peter is because they've seen too many like clown masses and they feel like the church isn't doing enough to the church isn't doing enough to get rid of that. I've
Hmm.
seen absolutely beautiful, emotionally touching Novus Ordo liturgies, not clown masses. I don't think I've ever seen a clown mass in real life. Not this like sappy on eagle's wings stuff. Like I've seen beautiful, reverent, traditional Latin new masses, Novus Ordo liturgies. I have seen that, and I think it can be done, and it is done in a lot of places.
Yeah.
But I think there's a certain contingent of the traditional of the traditionalist movement that's not so much concerned with theological problems with the new mass as much as the emotional difficulty in terms of separating the uh, the liturgical abuse from the Latin mass from the new mass as such. Like they have a difficult time uncoupling those two things.
Yeah.
And so how much of an obstacle do you think that is in radical traditionalism? And what are some things that you would suggest you know, to sort of overcome with or avoid that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's one I've been wrestling with recently. Um, there are it's easy to say let's just fix the new mass and then like everyone can just celebrate the new mass. The problem is there's there's so many legitimate differences between the new and the old mass that traditionalists will see as either inadequate or as abuses even, um, and it will it will make it nearly impossible for them to um, try to celebrate the Novus Ordo the same way the traditional Latin Mass is celebrated. My take is that they're not supposed to be celebrated the same way. Um, you can have Gregorian chant and Latin and reverence and incense and all of that in the Novus Ordo. You can, um, but holding that up as a standard for the Novus Ordo, I think, is the wrong approach because the Novus Ordo in its formulation and in Sacrosanctum Concilium, there were um, established options for vernacular and for enculturation and for different variations, um, which allow things like on eagle's wings. Even if you don't like it, that's a legitimate variation. And um, the faithful just need to come to terms with that. If they don't like that a specific parish celebrates with those hymns, find a different parish perhaps. But the idea that the Novus Ordo is only celebrated well when it looks like a Latin mass, I think is incorrect. Um, it's ultimately up to the bishops' conference and the bishop of a particular diocese whether and to what extent Latin will be used, or whether and to what extent Gregorian chant will be used. Now, I go to a mass that uses Gregorian chant, and we use polyphony, and we use Latin, and we use a lot of incense, and we have only male altar servers, and what have you. But I also attend throughout the week parishes that don't do that, and I think familiarizing yourself with what is and what is not an abuse, um, according to what the church says, is an important step in making a smoother transition, because um, things like female altar servers are not an abuse. Receiving communion on the hand is not an abuse. Um, Receiving communion standing is totally fine. Actually, it's preferred. Um, I would say people want to say that kneeling is more reverent. I would say, in fact, standing for communion is more reverent because you're following what the church prefers, and you're enacting a more um, paschal posture. It's like the posture of the redeemed. It's the you're in a wedding procession. You're walking down the aisle, and it's like standing is the posture of the resurrected. Um, Kneeling is traditionally a more penitential posture, but um, communion is not the moment for penance. It's the moment for entering into the Paschal mystery and the wedding feast of the Lamb. Um, what else? We covered Gregorian chant, Latin. Um, yeah, lay Eucharistic ministers is another one. It's not an abuse to receive from a lay Eucharistic minister. It's not. Maybe you don't think the church needs a lay Eucharistic minister, um, but it's not less reverent to receive communion from a woman handing out communion. It's not any less or any more reverent than receiving from a priest. It might be um, more conducive to you personally because you don't have to deal with that inner question or conflict in your spirit, but ultimately just knowledge about these things will overcome the obstacles, and it's just a matter of catechesis, in my opinion.
And so a lot of it is learning how to think with the mind of the church, would you
Yeah,
say? Or yeah,
yeah.
you know,
Like they instituted a lot of these changes for good reasons. Um, you might not agree with all the reasoning, but you were never asked, and that's fine.
yeah, you know, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here because, I think a lot of the problem with the at least the more radical wing of traditionalism is the same issue that you see in fundamentalism just across the board, dogmatizing that which isn't dogmatic. So I mean, like for example, in the Western Church, and this is a cultural thing. The Western Church kneeling sometimes had the implication of penance. It didn't always have the implication of penance. Sometimes it's just a general act of humility. That's why, as you know, we received communion kneeling while, but in the Eastern Church, while they would very often like try to bow down or lower themselves slightly when receiving the Eucharist, as a sign of reverence or humility, they would never, kneel down because that was seen as a sign of penance. So
Yeah,
standing while lowering yourself slightly was created that balance
mhm,
between um, you know, joy and humility in the presence of your Lord. So there is a legitimate cultural difference that exists there.
Yeah.
And so this notion that maybe, and I personally would lean towards this, that, you know, kneeling when receiving the Eucharist is more reverent, if for no other reason than it's not so much the alternative, because we didn't go from, you know, the traditional Western to something like what you see in the East. We went from what you saw in the West to an overly casual attitude. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible to be reverent through some other means, like as if that's the only gesture of humility in the presence of God, right? So I
Well,
think,
keep in mind, standing was the universal posture throughout the whole church for the first 1,000 years. If you want to be more in line with what the church fathers did, then you would receive standing.
yeah,
Um, the practice of kneeling arose in large part because in a medieval society, um, you would have the clerical class was almost like a ruling class. So you would have like the lords, and then you would have like the lower class, and it would be like the way you would treat a king is you kneel before a king. Um, and that's sort of that posture was adopted in the liturgy. So you're kneeling before God, which is it can be a sign of reverence, um, but what I think was missed in the Middle Ages is that you're not just kneeling before a king, you're also coming to meet a lover, um, a father, a friend. Jesus said, I no longer call you servants, but friends. Um, so God wants to have this relationship with us with in full light of our baptismal dignity. So we don't have to um, approach in a sort of like, woe is me, I'm just a sinner in light of God's infinite majesty. It's also with filial trust. And when you process down the aisle as if you're meeting a spouse, um, you don't you don't meet them and adopt a penitential attitude for them. You meet them in a gesture of reverence, but um, but with the mutual trust that you already love each other, and and you don't need to sort of grovel for their approval.
yeah, yeah, and I think that that's a sort of a broader issue of, again, coupled with this notion of absolutizing or dogmatizing that which is not dogmatic. There's also, you know, uh, this notion of people don't want to come to terms with what could be viewed as the messiness of, you know, church history. You know, how certain and you see this, you know, on both the left and the right. Neither side really wants to come to terms with the fact that history isn't always on their side, but it's this notion that taking what we take as normative now may not have necessarily been seen as normative in the past, you know. And so like you said, like the earliest Christians received standing, you know, that apart from questions of which one statistically produces more reverence, the most amount of the most amount of people, there's also the question of, is it possible, given the right conditions, to use another gesture to produce the same result? And if the minute you begin to say no, that's when you start to run into problems. Because not to get caught up in the issue of what's the best gesture of the Eucharist, but I was just using that as a sort of uh, you know, like a as just simply just a beacon for this larger debate of, you know, assuming that every single little feature of the way things are is the way it always has been and the way it always must by definition be,
Yeah.
and the notion that there's never any legitimate reason for change, which is, again, I think goes back to the issue of people don't know how to separate the reasons for the reform or the way the reform was supposed to look versus the way it was supposed to be implemented. And they don't know the difference between different but equally valid or equally legitimate expressions versus a good way and a bad way.
Yeah. So I think it's like a lot of traditionalists have this idea, and a lot of Catholics in general have this idea, that as something develops over time, the later expression is necessarily the better expression. That's not it's not as linear as that, because the church has changed her practice multiple times, and if you think that the latest practice is the best one, just because by the fact that it's later, then there would be no room for change, because you would have to stick with what is currently normative as if it were the best that it could be. So when kneeling fell out of practice for the most part after Vatican II, then the same logic that applies to the change that happened there would necessarily also be applied to the change that introduced kneeling. You would have to say, well, we can't kneel because standing was normative for so long. You can't have it both ways and say, well, it's you can't say, like, if kneeling is the latest acceptable practice, then therefore we can't change it, because you would have to apply that logic to when kneeling was introduced. You would have to say, well, standing has been the practice until now, so we can't introduce something new.
Yeah.
Now, on top of that, there is the question of fostering the discipline that the church wants to foster. So if the church wants to introduce a new practice and wants the faithful to get on board with that, then the faithful should, if they want to think with the church, they should try to get on board with that. The church has made provisions for kneeling, but she ultimately sees standing as the preferred normative posture, because it more directly expresses the truth of what communion is, and the resurrection claim that accompanies the reception of communion. In the 2002 General Instruction for the Roman Missal, the Missal, I think it's number 199. It says, in the 2002 version, it said, the faithful may kneel to receive communion, but if they do, the priest should basically take them aside and catechize them as to why standing is the norm and why it's preferred. So I don't think the church even sees this issue as they're two equal expressions. They're both allowed expressions, but one of them is preferred over the other. And you might feel like you're being more reverent by kneeling. I knelt for the longest time. Up until just like a year or so ago, I would kneel for communion every time I received it. Him, I guess. And I've always, received on the tongue. I've always thought that was more reverent. But if the church says that receiving on the hand is acceptable, then you have to agree with the church. Otherwise, you're judging her teaching as being incorrect, and your judgment as correct. But you have no standard upon which to base it, other than an arbitrary standard of your own making.
Yeah.
Because like, you could appeal to, let's say, scripture, or like some aesthetic sensibility, or you could appeal to like the history of cultural symbols, or your subjective feeling about what's more reverent. But those are all arbitrary in light of what the church prefers.
Yeah, and I guess this sort of leads to a broader question of, you know, like a lot of Catholics, particularly a lot of faithful Catholics, will tend to, add ex add more weight than they should to literally every part of church teaching, so that if a change happens, they don't know how to emotionally, deal with it. Which I guess leads to a question, that I personally have occasionally struggled with. And I do believe on some level it's possible to, separate, like being a fan of the Latin Mass with being an ideological radical. But the historical fact is that, the traditionalist movement began in the 70s, with, some of the founding fathers of the Sedevacanist movement and with Archbishop Lefebvre. And throughout the 70s and most of the 80s, if you want to go to a Latin Mass, those the only people you can get it from,
Right.
And it wasn't until much later, until the late 1980s, when you saw the rise of the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, which basically left the Society of St. Pius X because they thought it was going too far. They thought that they were too extreme. And so the more moderate wing of the traditionalist movement is more is a much more recent player on the field.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is a question of, the sort of the rebellion of the radical traditionalists sort of is deep in the traditionalist movement. And so this leads to the question of, is it possible to ever completely weed out that mindset from traditionalism, whether it be the sort of the rebelliousness, the the sense of absolutizing, the non-infallible.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to really fully separate those tendencies from the traditionalist movement?
I don't think we can say whether or not it is. Um, Perhaps it is, but I think we need to be clear about a couple of things. The first is that the reason the traditionalist movement exists, the reason the FSSP exists, is in large part because people couldn't come to terms with the reform. Um, and they had ideological commitments which prevented them from coming to terms with the reform. So that's where the movement originated. Um, whether whether you can separate the current use of the 1962 or pre-55 missile from that, that's uh, that's a more difficult question, and it's more of a hypothetical question because I don't think that that's where we're at. Um, and two more points. Where we're at today is the church has instituted a reform and wants to see the reform followed by everyone. In Traditionis Custodes and its accompanying letter, it says the bishop of a diocese has an obligation to lead the faithful of his diocese into unity under the one Roman Missal. And that means by definition that the church is actively invested in phasing out the 1962 Missal and pre-55. So that's where we're at today. Um, maybe the TLM can be separated from the movement that started that sort of created this right within a right, um, with the TLM, but as it stands, the reason people choose to go to the TLM, yes, there's beauty and there's history and all that, but ultimately, a lot of the markers around the TLM are it's seen as a refuge from modern currents. It's seen as a standard of orthodoxy apart from the magisterium. It's seen as a bulwark against um, change. Um, it serves as a symbol of resistance against the church, ultimately, in a lot of ways. And as long as it serves that purpose, and as long as it's exploited by ideological factions for that purpose, I don't think there's any saving it.
And so I guess all of this leads to what I view as sort of the last major question that I think, because we began by talking about obviously media and the general state of theological discourse and how, unfortunately, the radical left and the radical right have a tendency towards, sensationalism, polemicism. But I think a lot of this leads to the question of, um, like just a more specific question on theological discourse. Um, what is the best way for people to sort of move past the polemicism? And I think, even I mean, there's obviously some theological opinions that are just objectively false. There is an objective standard of orthodoxy in the church. We're not obviously not Protestants, but even within that standard, you could have someone who's more in line with the what I would call the broadly sort of contemporary mindset versus someone who's a little bit more traditional. There's a room for that. How do we allow both groups to be able to coexist within the church and dialogue with each other while still, without having to resort to polemicism? And, how do we overcome that attitude that leads to sort of ghettoization and polemics and schism? How do we overcome that to allow for legitimate dialogue, between different ideological leanings within the church?
Yeah. The first point, I think, is finding your starting point. And I think that has to be with the magisterium. St. Peter is, let me put it this way. The pillar and foundation of truth is the church. Scripture and tradition they didn't exist until the church compiled scripture and canonized it. And tradition was, and still is, a collection of views and traditions, lowercase t traditions, that until they are given normative authority by the magisterium, remain on the level of lowercase t traditions. Also distinguished from apostolic tradition, which ended with the death of the last apostle. So I should have been a little bit more clear. Scripture and apostolic tradition make up divine revelation, but anything following the death of the last apostle is a lowercase t tradition and should be regarded as such. And until the magisterium gives a specific interpretation to scripture or tradition, or makes normative a lowercase t tradition, it remains on the level of something that is sort of still up for interpretation or still up for dogmatization. So we shouldn't dogmatize anything that the church hasn't dogmatized. We can gather sort of pinpoints of knowledge from these different traditions and expressions and from Scripture, and that can help us form a coherent worldview. But unless and until the church um, makes a magisterial statement regarding any particular um, uh, pinpoint of knowledge, um, it remains your subjective interpretation until that point where it's determined to be objective with a specific objective meaning or interpretation. Hope that makes sense.
No, and I totally get it. And it's it goes back to that old quote that I think Augustine quoted that's often attributed to him, of there needs to be unity in the essentials, and then but there
Diversity in non-essentials and charity and all the rest.
yeah, and
Yeah.
so I think the minute we start to have that attitude, the minute we know what the church has defined, and all agree on that, and as long as when we're talking about where the church has not spoken, and not condemning as heretical something that doesn't actually violate the bounds of what the church has defined, I think that's when things will get a lot better, and I think they'll sort of curtail or reel in some of the extremes that we see in a lot of the discourse today.
Yeah.
And I feel like that should be the goal, is to establish that point of equilibrium, is agreement on what's defined, agreement on what's orthodox, and overcoming an adversarial attitude when it comes to the non-dogmatic,
Yeah.
of recognizing that something may be better than another, but that doesn't mean that the alternative is bad or heretical or damaging to souls.
Right. Yeah. So you can have a more um, social justice oriented view, or you can have a more like you can be more focused on church music or um, the way the liturgy is celebrated. Um, you shouldn't have one to the exclusion of the other, ideally. And not even just ideally, you can't. If you have one to the exclusion of the other, you've already fallen into radicalism. By definition, you're on an extreme and you've rejected the other end of what is also legitimate. So you've polarized what shouldn't be polarized. Um, you can you can have like preferences. Like you can serve at a soup kitchen and not serve on the altar as an altar server, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But you have to respect that there are other roles in the church that perform other functions, which are also legitimate. Um, and I think once we come to terms with that, allowing for the diversity in non-essentials, we'll be in a lot better place. But we haven't even gotten there yet.
Yeah.
Um, the problem, at least in America, the problem is that our theological positions often also track with our political persuasions.
Yeah.
So if you are someone who cares more about social justice, you'll be considered a Democrat or a liberal. Or if you care more about liturgy and um, doctrine, you're considered more conservative or Republican or something like that.
Yeah.
Um, that's not how church, that's not how theology works, first and foremost. But it's also just like when you create this split between two things which are essential, liturgy and serving the poor, you've already like thrown half of the faith out the window.
Yeah.
So it's not cohesive. It's not a way to live your faith,
Yeah.
and it's not charitable. And like ultimately, like we'll be judged on our love and our charity. And if you want to um, not be told by Jesus at the last judgment, "Depart from me," then you have to accept all of those non-negotiables. You have to serve the poor, welcome the stranger, do all these things, but also eat his flesh and blood and perform the more conservative, quote unquote, functions. So it's not liberal or conservative. There's room. It shouldn't be put in that framework in the first place, but there's room for the whole plethora of options within our faith.
Yeah. And that's definitely, I think, a good framework for moving forward on this, is recognizing that the faith is a cohesive, integral whole. And, you don't really have Catholicism if you have liturgy without social justice, or social justice without liturgy, or philosophy without mysticism, or,
Catholicism is universal. It encompasses the whole.
Yeah. 100%. Well, that is our interview for today. I just want to thank you so much for joining me today, and God bless. And I look forward to future discussions on this topic.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. You too.
Take care.